Hello everyone, welcome to the NCCR Evolving Language Polyvox Podcast. I'm here today with a PhD student, Jovana Maksic. She'll talk about her PhD, which she started pretty recently. How are you, Jovana?
Hi, I'm good. Thanks for having me.
You're doing a PhD. What's the topic of your PhD?
I just started my second year, but the topic of my PhD is looking at the neural signatures of technological complexity in stone tool making. More broadly, what that means is I'm trying to understand what kind of neurocognitive pressures the activities of producing stone tools might have placed on the brains of our hominin ancestors. Of course, we know that hominin minds, just minds in general, do not fossilize. And therefore, what I do on a sort of day-to-day is I study modern-day stone tool makers. And these people are also called flint knappers. The methodology that I use for the brain imaging, it's called functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It's easier to call it FNIRS. This device measures cortical activity by tracking blood oxygenation levels. So in principle, it works very similar to an MRI. But of course, it's quite different from an MRI because it allows you to move around. Rather than laying still in a scanner, with FNIRS, you can do all sorts of naturalistic tasks like dancing, sports.
And tool making.
And tool making, of course. Besides looking at the brain activity while they produce these tools, I'm also interested in the behavioral structure of the action of producing the stone tools. And what I do is look at the videos of where they actually produce these tools and try to understand micro actions involved.
And so the key question is, how did our ancestors make those tools, and how do we do it now?
We know from the archaeological record that our ancestors were pretty much consistently making different kinds of stone tools throughout the Paleolithic. And actually, the lithic record is one of the best preserved continuous record of hominin behavior.
When you say lithic, what's the...
So the Paleolithic refers to lithics, so it's really just stones.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And this gives us a very broad evolutionary timeline. So we know that the earliest stone tools date around 3.3 million years ago, and this is called the Lomequian technology. And then we also have stone tools ranging up to 10,000 years ago, and this is more like upper Paleolithic technologies. Over this very broad time span of evolution, we know that several different hominin species were making these stone tools. And just to say a little bit more about the nature of the stone tools, some of the earliest stone tools, they're called the old one technologies. They date around 2.6 million years ago. And if you imagine how these tools look like, what they were used for, they are relatively simple. So that means that you just take a flintstone and you remove a couple of flakes. And if you have a nice edge that is sharp enough, then you can use it for things like cutting meat, processing plants, or even breaking bones to access the bone marrow, which was, of course, very important for our ancestors. And later, you see a very interesting change happening at around 1.7 million years ago, which is the advent of something called the Acheulean tradition. And here you start seeing more symmetrical tools and standardized forms. So things like hand axes, they are quite complex compared to just relatively simple older one tools. And this suggests not only that there were changes in the cognitive capacities of our ancestors, but also this suggests that there were some important changes in social and cultural transmission. There were even some theories out there that some of these tools were so large, like the hand axes, that They might have not even been so practical for use, like butchering and killing, but rather they were like the artistic expression of the tool maker. These stone tools were not just about sustenance, or maybe they were at the beginning, but clearly they become much more over the span of the Paleolithic, and they become important cultural signatures as well. In the past, people in this field, which is sort of affectionately called neuroarchaeology, have been very interested in the transition between the older one and the Acheulean, which I've mentioned. And the reason is that purely by looking at the brain size of hominins during this period, we know that something interesting begins happening with brains at the advent of the early Acheulean. So brains begin expanding exponentially in size. And there's probably many reasons to this, but why it's interesting to look at stone tool making is trying to figure out, okay, maybe there was something about making hand axes that might have placed additional cognitive pressures on our minds and therefore the brain.
Now, more about the actual making of the tool. Like in the archaeological records, you have the finalized tool or maybe some intermediate forms, but then how do you study how exactly people make it?
I really wanted to get to this because it's pretty much the core of my PhD. The field of cognitive and experimental archaeology pretty much deals with this approach where rather than only looking at the finished product from the archaeological record, you actually try to mimic the behaviors that might have been involved in creating these tools. If you try to imagine how a tool or anything else in the Paleolithic was made, you really need to begin by imagining every step that went into that process. So in the case of stone tools, we need to imagine a hominin firstly going out to find the right kind of stone and the right kind of material to make that tool, and then working on the tool, and then maybe using it a little bit, and then going back, working again on it. This is a sort of like process-oriented thinking. In contemporary experimental and cognitive archaeology, people try to really mimic these processes in the lab and then try to look at the behaviors that you get by mimicking these things. In my case, I record very detailed videos of these flint knappers who make the tools, different kinds of tools that I instruct them to do. And then I really look at how this production takes place, what kinds of motor behaviors or changes in hand grip are happening.
And then within this experiment, where does the NCCR come into place?
Well, we actually want to have the participant wear the cap while they are reproducing the tools from specific periods that we are interested in. And what we know so far is that the older one, which if you remember, was this very, relatively simple tool that mostly requires you to just remove a couple of flakes and get a sharp edge. And the Acheulean, which is this nice symmetrical hand axe, the older one seems to be based in mostly sensory motor and visual areas. So that reflects kind of immediate processing, working with the stone, rotating it, understanding its properties, and kind of coordinating your hand accordingly. And while in the Acheulean, these scientists have found an additional activation, mostly in the prefrontal regions. And this has been linked to different things, one of them being an increase in working memory, for example. So there seems to be something interesting that we can get at with NCCR. And now what I want to do is take a closer look at the individual production steps of these technologies rather than just using categories like older one or Acheulean.
Mm-hmm. So all these processes, what do they teach us about human evolution?
I think we can probably dissect it into several different segments. So, for example, if we are trying to understand cognition, this gives us a very nice continuous record of not just how hominins were interacting with the tools and their environment, but also how the cognition and brains were changing at the same time. So, for example, we can look at how these trends that we see in the lithic record compare to trends in fossil endocasts. So basically just looking at the size and the properties of brains in parallel. And then on the other hand, we can also try to understand how the hand morphology might have developed in parallel with tool making. There were some changes in hand dexterity throughout our evolution. There was a very famous case of bonobo called kanzi, which I think the NCCR is more than familiar with. And over the last several decades, anthropologists actually wanted to train kanzi to make stone tools. What turned out to be the case is that kanzi actually did get relatively okay at removing flakes, and he understood the concept of, I need to get a sharp flake because that flake will let me cut, let's say, a rope that connects to a box, and in the box I get some food. But what kanzi was not able to do is really get this level of dexterity that is necessary to shape the tool in a finer way. So in a sense, this was something that seems to be very important in our evolution, this continued hand dexterity. And of course, this also has implications for our brains. So we know that throughout evolution, some additional brain areas appeared that seemed to be involved in this very fine control of fingers and grip and things like that. So that's also another thing we can learn. And then, of course, the really big question that we want to get to here is language, which is the whole reason why this project is in the NCCR. It's a very interesting link, and there's several ways to look at it. One of the most prominent sort of hypothesis is called the technological hypothesis of language, which claims that it was the tool-making context that actually prompted the development of language. Of course, there's different variations in how this hypothesis is manifested. So some people emphasize the cognitive requirements and demands of tool making, and that essentially it was very important to already have skills like sequential behavior, chunking actions together, structuring a tool-making sequence into smaller units, which, as we know, has many parallels to how a linguistic processing works. Also, in tool-making, you also get these nested steps and hierarchies, which sort of mimics how things like tree structures and syntactic processing works. So that line of reasoning really focuses on like what is the cognitive overlap of tool making and language, and maybe some of these skills were already there in place, especially in the brain, and then language and like broader language might have piggybacked on these existing neural circuits that were there. And then the other flavor of the technological hypothesis actually focuses on technological pedagogy. It really focuses on the more interactional side of tool making because, as we talked about, at some point it becomes clear that these kinds of stone tools like hand axe, or especially later technologies like Levallois and these more complicated Upper Paleolithic tools, they couldn't be innovated by a single individual. They required some kind of teaching, some kind of transmission, social and cultural. So this whole idea of technological pedagogy claims that at some point we went from having a gestural language to speech, because the necessity of transmitting increasingly complex stone tool technologies actually placed pressures on the communicative system.
So now you're a year into your PhD project. How far have you come into the getting results, or have you started the experiments?
Now, roughly a year in, I have mostly worked on planning my experimental design. I have to say, finding the right neuroimaging approach for this kind of experiment has been probably the biggest challenge. Of course, it's not magic. Just because we have a scanner on someone's head while they make stone tools doesn't mean that we can just extract everything that's happening. So we really need to think about, how do we time these experiments? What are we looking to find? What are some constraints of resolution that this signal can actually provide? Also, I have been working on collecting and analyzing a lot of videos of flint napping. I even visited some expert flint nappers in their home, which was a very interesting experience. In the process, I've also began learning how to make some very basic stone tools, which I have to say, it's very difficult. But once you get a hang of just the movement of removing a flake, it becomes quite addictive. So I can definitely understand our ancestors. I now have collected a lot of videos and I started coding these videos myself. What I have been doing is basically just trying to look at every second that happens of the production process. And I got some preliminary results. They're very preliminary, but there's still more work to be done. And at the same time, I've been working on a project with the UZH data science team with Lars Malmström, who is really fantastic. He's a machine learning expert, and we've been working on developing a machine decoder that actually can automatically detect these archaeological steps as we define them from the videos.
And so what are your next steps now?
Actually, I just started my first pilot experiments. In the lab, I wanted to first just see if we do these very intense movements, how does that impact the brain signal? Because you can imagine that, there might be a lot of vigorous movement when you remove a flake. So we need to make sure that what we are measuring is really the brain signal and not just motion artifact. And then another thing that I'm actually going to do next week is I'm visiting a international flint napping symposium, which is it's very exciting. It's going to take place in Dordogne in France at a very important historical site, actually. So I'm going there not just for fun and to see some cool cave paintings, but also to record a lot more videos, hopefully of more complicated Upper Paleolithic technologies. And in addition, I want to do my subject recruitment there.
Yeah, I hope you'll find people that are interested in your project, I'm sure. And then otherwise you can do it yourself now that you're a flint napper, a baby flint napper.
I think I can only recreate the lower Paleolithic somewhat, but beyond that,
a non-animal, a non-human
I can do
style.
It like Kanzi, pretty much, just like bang the rock together, get some flakes.
Thank you so much for being here, Jovana. It was super nice to hear from your research. We're super excited to hear more in the future.
Thank you for having me. This was very, very nice, and I really enjoyed chatting with you. And hopefully chat more in a few years when there's much more to show. And thanks again. Bye.